And welcome back to an episode of the Cool Your Jets podcast. Rio's Ben Blessington and Michael Nania. Michael, have you recovered from this past weekend's playoff football games? I think that may have been the best weekend of football I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still thinking about it. It was absolutely crazy just to get 4 games in a row in which wire to wire were completely competitive. I guess except parts of the Rams game because it really did seem like that was over for a short period there. But it was a very exciting weekend, and you and I were talking about this before we started recording. But one of the silver linings, I guess, of the Jets being as bad as they are is that we don't really have to watch these games where we're so invested to where if the Jets lose, we're so heartbroken that it ruins our lives for the rest of the week or even months to come. We get to the point where it's basically like apathy. Like they lose these games, you expect them to lose. It's okay, it's absolutely what you think is going to happen. But when you're a team that's competing for a Super Bowl and you're in the playoffs, and I know I'm explaining something that's foreign to us as Jets fans at this point, but you're so invested to where those losses are devastating. Just imagine Bills fans are going to be thinking about those last 13 seconds every day for the next 9 months now. They should be preparing to host the AFC Championship game in Western New York for the first time in over 2 decades. And now they're sitting at home. So it is kind of nice that we don't have to take those type of losses because I can't imagine how I would be dealing with that. I mean, I wouldn't leave my bedroom for the next week after that happened. I would lock myself in my closet and just cry.
I don't
But
know if I don't
we
know if
don't we don't have to deal with that, fortunately. I
I
guess.
don't know,
I guess that is a silver lining.
I don't know if I'd define it as nice that the Jets are as bad as they are, but it's certainly added years onto my life. The fact that they haven't had too many of those moments. I mean, they've still broken my heart plenty of times, but I was just sitting there because originally I went into that game just cheering for Kansas City, didn't want Buffalo to win. And as it got towards the end of it, I had a bit of empathy for those Bills fans. I'm just like, if the Jets were ever in this position and they blew this game, you're right. I mean, it would be devastating. But like you said, I mean, we're so bad that we don't have to worry about that. But hey, hopefully someday they can, break our hearts in a much more dramatic fashion than they have the last few seasons. Um, well, I don't know if there's a great segue to what we want to do today, Michael, but we were looking at the JetX offseason simulator and we decided, why don't you and I take a run of it individually, both giving what our ideal off seasons would look like. On the outset, it's January right now, so a lot of things change. And we'll just talk about it. But before we do that, let's get into the main needs of the Jets because I think it's important to establish, okay, what exactly every single need. And look, you can't address every single need in an offseason, especially the way the state of the Jets the last few seasons. But I think the Jets have a really good opportunity to knock out the vast majority of these needs. So, Michael, let's just run through the roster here. And then really quickly, let's just decide, let's just discuss some of the options, whether it's like, is this a need that they punt until next year? Do they look at free agency? Do they look to re-sign somebody? Look at the draft? And let's start at, backup quarterback, for example. Right now, Mike White, Joe Flacco, both pending free agents. Mike White's a restricted free agent. I would imagine Mike White definitely gets brought back. Saleh alluded to the fact that they want to bring Flacco back as well. So that seems like a need where I don't think they're going to go externally. At the very least, they're bringing Mike White back, but it does sound like they might try to bring Joe Flacco back as well. But when you go further down the offensive depth chart, running back, I think that's an underrated need as well because I think Michael Carter was so good last year that he overshadows that. Look, typically you look at San Francisco, this has been a position that has just been running back by committee. It seems like every single year Kyle Shanahan has a new darling in the backfield. They're part of that's due to injuries. And then you can even look at like a team like Green Bay, who, although they have Aaron Jones, who's a very good player comp for Michael Carter, they also have a guy like A.J. Dillon who complements him really well and can bring that power. So when you look at the running back position, Michael, I mean, what type of running back should they be looking to bring in? Is it just one? Is it two? I mean, do you think that this running back position gets a bit of a makeover this offseason, or do you think they look to address some other needs with their assets?
I think there will definitely be moves here because, like you said, I think they want this. Mike LaFleur, just based on his background, really wants this to be a committee backfield, and that doesn't mean Michael Carter won't be the clear number one guy going forward. But even when he was playing well towards the end of the season, he was never, the only guy getting touches throughout the entire year. There was always a second third guy in the mix. Ty Johnson, Tevin Coleman, Austin Walter at times. So that is definitely what they want to do. And you look at the reps that Ty Johnson was getting this year, and the way he played hurt the team a lot. I mean, he had the most drops of any running back. I believe he gave up the most pressures in pass protection of any running back as well. So those things just can't happen. And I think that that is the number one most important area where they need to improve is I think they need a reliable third down guy. He doesn't have to be the best, most explosive athlete or skilled all around player, but just a guy who's fundamentally sound, who you can rely on to pass block, who can catch easy passes in the flat without dropping them. I think a player like that would be key because for whatever reason, Michael Carter wasn't getting a ton of third down reps this year. They would consistently yield to Johnson, sometimes Tevin Coleman in those situations. So it does seem like they want that type of guy to complement Carter, who's more so the early down back. So they need someone who is actually proficient at those passing game skills, which Ty Johnson wasn't. In addition to that, I think you could get like a home run hitter kind of guy with top end speed because as good as Carter is, I feel like top end speed is not one of his strengths. There were a few runs where he broke out and did a great job, getting to that second, third level, but you could see he doesn't quite have that speed to get those 70, 80-yard runs. And at the last line defense, safeties and corners can catch up to him, which is a small hole in his game because he's so good at many other things. But I think a home run hitter who could just give them one or two or three of, I mean, not one or two, but just a handful of those, breakthrough runs over the course
Right.
of the season. So I'd say those are the two things I could focus on a running back.
I disagree with you a little bit, and only in the sense that maybe it's not, maybe disagree is the wrong word. I kind of feel like they could bring back a guy like Tevin Coleman, who struggled through injuries, so maybe that's not the right move. There are guys, and look, there's great running backs in free agency every year because it's an oversaturated position group. I love the idea of just continuously drafting a running back day 3 of the draft, pretty much every year. I mean, Joe Douglas has done it twice. It's worked once. Michael P. Ryan, maybe not so much. So I definitely think they should draft a guy. But I think you could bring back a guy like Tevin Coleman, and I like the burst that he was giving and that little change of pace that you're talking about. I kind of think that they could have used maybe more of a, I think they tried to use P Ryan as a bit of a power back. I look at with the Packers, especially when you get into January and December football, and it helps to have that big bruising back. I mean, Michael Carter certainly can be a powerful running back, but if the Jets could go ahead and bring in a big bruising back and bring back Tevin Coleman, I think they have a nice wide variety of running backs in that group. But like you said, I mean, I think you could just stick with, you know, obviously Michael Carter's in the room, and then you could go try to attack and bring in more of a home run threat. Raheem Mostert's a guy who also, like Coleman, had a lot of injury issues, but obviously familiar with the system and can be more of that home run change of pace, maybe even that third down back. I do think that's a position you're going to see a lot of movement at, and I think the other position in the backfield is fullback. I think it kind of gets swept under the rug because the Jets played Wesco there, and then obviously they signed Nick Bodden. I think most likely Nick Bodden and Wesco are kind of battling it out, and either way, if Bodden wins the competition, I still think Wesco has a chance to make it just as a tight end. But I wouldn't be surprised if like a guy like Patrick Ricard, who's supposed to hit free agency, wouldn't be surprised if the Jets talk to him and see what exactly he would be looking for, because I would find it hard to believe that LaFleur doesn't want to run more 12 personnel or 21 personnel or 22 personnel, get the fullback involved like he had with Juszczyk in San Francisco. So I think that's a position to keep an eye out for. Obviously, when you go to the weapons, the Jets receiver room is not nearly as bad as it has been in years past. I mean, I think people are, and I'm going to go back on this when we get to our offseason a little bit, but maybe people are overestimating how big of a need receiver is. It's more of, you have a young quarterback. You just watch the offensive explosions over the weekend, and you see what an elite receiving room can do for a young quarterback. So it's like, go all in and just make receiver, or not the best, but arguably the best position group on your team, and drown your young quarterback with talent. So I love that. So I think the Jets definitely need a top end receiver, a receiver one, and there's plenty of different avenues. They can look at free agency. If a guy like Devontae Adams to shake free, they could take a chance on a guy with coming off an ACL like Chris Godwin, who I actually think has a very realistic chance of getting away. But he's not going to be able to practice all offseason, and maybe he won't be ready for week one. That's also the case with Michael Gallup. And then you could look for trades. Obviously, there's Calvin Ridley, and then obviously there's the draft. So they need that. And then I also think you could use some more depth at receiver, whether you're bringing back Keelan Cole or you're re-signing Braxton Berrios or you're taking somebody later in the draft or whatever. I think this is a position that it looks good. I like the way Elijah Moore, and I'm maybe higher on Corey Davis than others, but I still think that they need to keep adding to this group to make sure Zach Wilson is really drowned with talent. What are you thinking about? Obviously, we're going to get to our off seasons in a second, but what do you think about that wide receiver market and the opportunity Joe Douglas has to really improve this position?
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I think that this is a position where it's not necessarily as weak as other positions on the roster. You know, you have Elijah Moore, you have Corey Davis, which is a nice solid duo as long as Corey Davis can erase some of the outlier drop issues he had last season and get closer to that Tennessee 2020 level. So that's a nice duo. And Elijah Moore has great potential. He does have legitimate ability to be a star caliber kind of receiver. So there are weaker positions on this team, but the need more so stems from the idea of let's not just be okay here. Let's make sure, like exactly what you said, let's help our young quarterback as much as possible. And there are opportunities for them to do that with multiple first round prospects that make sense for them at that 10th pick, or possibly if they move down, might be better values. And then there's going to be quite a few big names potentially on the trade market: Calvin Ridley, Amari Cooper. Then in free agency, Devontae Adams. It looks like he's going to shake free with Aaron Rodgers potentially leaving and Green Bay having a terrible cap situation. So Chris Godwin. So there are a lot of avenues for them to improve. Not just improve, but find that Stephon Diggs, that DeAndre Hopkins. Obviously not a veteran receiver, but that Jamar Chase for the Bengals. That guy really helped the young quarterback take that next leap. So that's the primary thing for me. I think bringing back Braxton Berrios within reason is definitely a must. But in addition to that, I think getting that bona fide top weapon for Zach Wilson is a very big goal for them to try to accomplish.
Yeah, and then obviously rounding out the offense is the offensive line, and kind of like the receiver room. I don't think again it's much better than it has been in years past this room, especially if you bring back LDT and with Becton coming back. That offensive line and I don't know who's playing left tackle and who's playing right tackle, for argument's sake, let's just say a Becton at left tackle, AVT, McGovern, LDT, and George Fant is much better than the Jets have had in years past. And theoretically, you could, I mean, you look at a team like the Bengals who have an awful offensive line. The Jets probably have a middle of the pack offensive line, especially when you factor in continuity, those guys all coming back, playing under the same system, Zach Wilson getting better and getting the ball out of his hands faster. You would expect that the offensive line play, if they brought everybody back, would get a little bit better. So the Jets have probably, what would you say, a middle of the pack offensive line, depending on
Yeah.
how AVT and Becton develop. And they could roll with that. They could put all their assets elsewhere and just rely on a solid offensive line, but that's just not going to be the case. And if you listen to any Joe Douglas presser ever, especially the end of season press conference, he literally says, if we're going to get to where we want to go to, we have to be the best in the trenches. So he's telling Jets fans exactly what to expect, that they may, I don't think they're going to necessarily ignore receiver or something like that, but they are going to always prioritize the trenches. So it wouldn't surprise me if picks 4 and 10 are both trench players. They take an offensive lineman at 4 and they take a defensive lineman at 10. It would not surprise me. So an offensive line, it's like you could go and cut McGovern and try to sign, somebody better like Jensen, or obviously there's Linderbaum in the draft. And at right guard, there's a lot of different options in free agency. It feels like we've been talking about Brandon Scherf forever. And then obviously right tackle, it's an interesting situation. It's like, who is Mekhi Becton? Can he stay in the field? And then when you look at George Fant, is he a guy who can only put up numbers at left tackle? And was his season legit, or was it a bit of an anomaly due to a weaker schedule? So there's a lot of questions, I think, in offensive line. But as we said, that is a position that you don't have to ask, is it going to get addressed in free agency or the draft? The answer is both. I think they're going to go after that position primarily through the draft. I think you're going to see the Jets really boost this talent group. Let's get to the defense, and then let's move on with our simulators. Obviously, the Jets, just like the offensive line, flip side of it, defensive line, and it's not just edge. It's not just edge. Defensive tackle is a big need for this team as well. And I'll give the mic to you, Michael, because you've been talking about this a lot the ineffectiveness of a guy like Sheldon Rankins, who had some name value, got a sizable contract, and he had a few flashy plays. So I think fans may be under the impression that Sheldon Rankins is a good player, but as you've seen, he was really holding this Jets defense back, particularly in the run game.
Yeah, I'm going to be critical of Sheldon Rankins because defensive tackle in general, like it doesn't get criticized enough because it's hard to notice when they do bad things, because like a quarterback throws an interception, it's easy to see that's bad. Wide receiver drops a pass, cornerback gives up a catch. Those positions are easy to criticize, but defensive tackle, it's harder to notice like bad play, but they can be bad just like any other position because there's always a league average. There's always a level that, is right in the middle of the pack compared to everybody else. And Sheldon Rankins was below that. I like the addition. It was surprising at first when they made it, but he made sense. He was a scheme fit. He's a penetrating guy who was a very solid pass rusher with the Saints. And it really seemed like he was going to make just be another weapon in this pass rush. But he really didn't have a great year. When he did make plays, it stood out because, again, he is a talented guy and a great scheme fit, explosive off the ball. So when he did make plays, they really stood out. But he was getting destroyed in the run game for much of this year. There are so many plays you can find where he's, not just because of the scheme, just, exploding up the field, but just legitimately getting moved by his blocker, not holding his ground and really creating a lot of running room. He was a big part of the run defense struggles this year. And then he didn't make up for it in the passing game because his pressure rates and his win rates were way down compared to the rest of his career. He was actually a below average pass rusher. And then you couple that with his run defense, which I thought was pretty bad, frankly. It was a very disappointing season. And I think with the money you could save by cutting him, I think it's definitely worth it. So we'll see what happens. They could definitely bring him back and hope for a bounce back year. But personally, I think his performance this year was disappointing and quietly one of the biggest reasons that the Jets struggled defensively. So I think that there are ways they can improve on the defensive line. This is a pretty solid defensive tackle class in free agency. It doesn't have a huge superstar, but the Jets aren't looking for that. They're just looking for a guy in Rankin's price range, a mid-tier starter who fits the scheme. They're going to need a run stuffer, I think, because we'll see what they do with Fadakasi. Do they bring him back? I think he sort of was not quite as dominant in the scheme as he was in the 3-4. Well, they weren't necessarily just a 3-4, it's more of a hybrid scheme, but definitely this year he wasn't quite as dominant, playing with a more aggressive mentality. So that's another question. They're going to need some run stuffing if they don't bring back Fadakasi. If they don't bring back Rankins, they're going to need a pass rusher. So defensive tackle is quietly a pretty sizable need, not necessarily that they have to make a huge investment, but they might need multiple rotation players.
Yeah, this is ideally would be the deepest position on the team if it's up to Robert Saleh. I mean, you saw how often the Jets are putting in pretty much no-name players in the defensive line just for the sake of a rotation. He wants to keep those guys fresh, which I like. I didn't like how a lot of times it seemed like they would sub an entire starting lineup out for the backups. Like, I don't know if you ever play like 2K and you just put your bench lineup in. It's
Yeah.
like, well, the bench lineup against the other team starters, that's not very fair. You got to filter the rotation. So I think that's something Ulbrich can improve on. But they want to be deep there. They want to be rotating everybody in constantly. And when you look at defensive tackle, you can kind of knock two birds out with one stone if you bring in an elite edge rusher. If you bring in somebody elite opposite Carl Lawson, you can move John Franklin Myers back to 3 tech, which I think as you've pointed out many times, and as most people have noted, he seems to be better. Not that he can't play edge, but maybe like a guy like Eric Armstead, you can put him out at edge in first and second down and run situations, but on third down, you want him inside. And then with that case, it's like, okay, does Quinnen then take the run stuff or Foley Fatukasi role? Obviously, Quinnen's still going to pass rush, but is he going to be playing more of that 1 tech? And I think Quinnen could do that. So you could knock two birds out with one stone if you get edge, but I still think you need depth at edge and at defensive tackle. And like you said, Fatukasi, great locker room guy, captain, very, very good player in a 3-4. Probably a solid player in a 4-3. It really comes down to the money with him. I mean, if he's not getting top tier money, and you see this all the time, especially for agents on bad teams, How many times have we seen a guy, the Jets sign somebody who's like, wow, that cheap? Or even a guy like Robbie Anderson, when he left, people were shocked with the contract he was going to get, because I think people tend to overestimate what NFL teams are willing to pay. So a guy like Foley Fatukasi, I could see brought back to be that run stuffer, um, if the money is fairly cheap, if they get him on a really good team friendly deal. But other than that, I think you're right, because even if he comes back, I don't expect to see him on the field as much as maybe you did last year. I think it's very strictly rundowns for him. And then the rest of the defense, I mean, look, this was a bad defense, and they have holes everywhere. I mean, that's just the truth of the matter. I think you need another linebacker next to CJ Mosley if you really want to take an elite step. I like Quincy Williams a lot. He is a guy that you should try to develop, and I think he may very well develop into a good linebacker, but I think he's better in that third linebacker, that Sam linebacker. When you go to your base personnel, you can bring Quincy Williams in, but they need another guy in their nickel packages, a really good pass coverage linebacker. And again, Quincy Williams could develop into that, but if you could you look at San Francisco's defense, how do they win? They have a dominant defensive line, and they have amazing linebackers. I mean, those linebackers, and when I say amazing, I mean more so how reactionary they are, how in control of the game they are, yet they play so fast. And the front seven wins the entire game for San Francisco. You can watch it this weekend. Win or lose, you'll see what I'm talking about. The secondary for San Francisco doesn't matter nearly as much. You need competent players there. You need guys with good play recognition. You need good safeties who can swarm the ball and corners who can make plays on the ball. But the front seven is the juice of this defense. So they're going to add a lot to defensive line, and I think you're going to see a big move at linebacker. And again, it wouldn't surprise me if they take one round one. There's a couple of linebackers, one of which Saleh and Co will get to work with at the Senior Bowl. It would not surprise me if the Jets take a linebacker really early in the draft. Um, and then I guess I'll give you secondary real quick before we get out and do the simulator. Obviously, need to add another corner opposite Bryce Hall. You could argue maybe add another one to try to compete with Guidry to be that third, fourth corner, or compete in the slot against Michael Carter. And then obviously the safety position has been an utter nightmare. So what do you think about the Jets' options in improving the back half of their defense? Do you think, and I guess I could throw a linebacker in there as well since you didn't get a chance to answer, do you think it's more likely when you look at this defense as a whole that some people have mentioned, buy the defense and draft the offense, which it doesn't really ever work that simply, but do you think the Jets have enough ammunition and free agency? Maybe not do the Jets have enough, but just does this free agency class have enough ammunition for the Jets to buy a defense? Or do you think this is going to be a largely a drafted unit or a mix of both?
Well, I think the safety position in free agency is a good opportunity for them. I think that's the one position where they really have to upgrade, because linebacker and corner, then it starts to get a little bit more subjective based on their opinions. Because linebacker, do they like Quincy Williams? Personally, I'm not a fan of him as a starter. I think he offers a lot as a reserve, like you mentioned. But as a starter, I think you can get a lot better, more consistent, more reliable, a player who's more suited to a starting role. But do they think that? We'll have to see, because it seems like they are kind of fond of Quincy Williams. And then at the cornerback position, it's not a position that Joe Douglas has valued since he's come here in terms of premium investments. It's not a position that the Niners valued in a premium way when Robert Saleh was with San Francisco. So are they going to buck that trend and start and make a big move at cornerback this offseason? We'll see. I think they could, because I think they can upgrade a lot there. But well, we'll have to see, because it is, if there's any position you could argue that they could, put on the back burner for now, it's probably corner, just because, you've young talent, guys who survived, did well this year, and have a year in the scheme and can build upon that next year. And it's a position that benefits from the pass rush and all the players up front. So it all depends, those two spots, on how they feel about their players and how they feel about the positional value of those spots. But safety, they don't have anything at safety right now. Ashton Davis is under contract. You can consider Jason Pinnock a safety, and that's it. So they need players there. You can bring back Marcus Joyner, but free agency, there are a lot of options, depending on how franchise tags go. But Jesse Bates, Marcus Williams seems like a lock to shake free just based on the Saints cap situation. Quandre Diggs, J-Ron Curse, Xavier Woods, Jaquaski Tart from the Niners, if they want a familiar name. So there are some solid safeties out there. I think they could grab Tyrann Mathieu if they want to make a splashy move. So there are a lot of safety options, and that's the biggest clear hole on defense. Like you have to get starters because you just don't have them. Whereas other positions, it's more like how do you feel about your players? How do you feel about the positional value? But safety, they really have to make a big move there. And I think that the free agent market at that position gives them the opportunity to do that.
All right, Michael, let's get into the JetX simulator. For those who don't know, if you go to jetsxfactor.com, you become a member. There is an off-season simulator. It's a really cool tool to kind of just run your own Jets off-season. You can choose to resign guys, free agents, draft. So Michael and I each did our own. I may have cheated a little bit in the sense that I made some trades that I didn't do on the program, but we did use this to work through an entire offseason. Let me start with this. Was there anybody, because the first step is clear some space. Is there anybody you cut that I'm not about to list here? Because I'm going to list 3 guys who seem fairly obvious. Maybe you kept some, maybe you cut the other ones. I should add before I get into this, what I've learned from Joe Douglas the last 2 off seasons is he doesn't necessarily just cut guys to make space immediately. Even if a guy is technically overpaid, a lot of times those guys are on the team until training camp and then they get cut and then you see that money roll over. I've known, I think GVR was a good example last year. Obviously, he went and started. So maybe Alex Lewis or somebody like that. They've had guys like that where I think we all assumed they were going to get cut because they always overpaid. You can get somebody for a better deal. But a lot of times it's like once they're in the building, once you've negotiated that contract and you see what else is out there, it's like, all right, we can still just bring this guy back for depth and then cut him later if we want. So I will say the 3 guys I ended up cutting because they already cut Shaq Lawson, Greg Van Roten, Ryan Griffin, Sheldon Rankins. Did you keep any of those 3? Um, or did you add any other cuts?
No, I'm right with you. Those are
Okay.
my 3.
The only other one that I did consider was Justin Hardy, who's making $2 million next year, special teamer, maybe slightly overrated. But and it's like how many teams have a designated special teamer who's not a return man? Especially if you're going to go play Braxton Berrios a good amount of money, and part of the argument is for what he brings in special teams. It's like, well, you can steal some money from Justin Hardy because how many designated gunners are in the NFL? A guy who doesn't play corner at all. But for right now, deciding my previous logic, I'll keep him on the team. He seems like a very good team leader, does a lot of his huddle stuff, not in the locker room, but it seems like he's a well-respected guy there. So
Yeah,
as far
and
as
quick
cuts
on
go,
Hardy. I mean, like I could see the argument for sure, but just recently I went through all their big kick returns this year, and he was a key blocker on more of their good kick returns than any other player. So I know he had a lot of penalties this year, and that was disappointing. He missed some tackles, but he did still make a lot of tackles, and the blocking, he was a huge part of that, just as much as Barrios, really. I think his blocking was key. So I could absolutely see them making that cut, but I think he is good enough to warrant it, especially when you consider the off field stuff like you mentioned.
now, of course, I've already run through the simulator and this didn't pop into my head until now, but we probably should have noted the total amount of cap space we were left with. Do you remember? It was like close to 60 million, right? It was like 60-ish million.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Okay. It was somewhere around there. Of course, forgot to write that down, but about 60 million. Let's talk about the guys you wanted to resign. I'll hand it over to you first. Just run through who are the guys that you wanted to bring back to New York.
So I did bring back Lamarcus Joyner. I feel like with the lack of depth at safety, doesn't necessarily guarantee he'll start, but just good to have around. I think that he fits what they want to do, fits what they need if he's healthy. I brought back Mike White to be my backup quarterback. Braxton Berrios, of course,
Well, you know
and
what
Kyle. All right, good.
you know what might be a good way to do this. Let's go through these players individually because actually I think we do agree a lot on these players. I agree with all 3 of
Okay.
them that you just said. Keep going down the list, though. And we'll both give our answers. Who's next?
And Kyle Phillips. I kind of went light on this one and didn't just rack up every single player. I mean, if you got a few more, I'd probably agree with some of them.
Oh, I got
But
a lot
the
more.
the main 4 I want to hit on were Joyner, Mike White, Braxton Berrios, and Kyle Phillips.
Yeah, I got a lot more than you. And I do think you might be under. I mean, I know you weren't going fully, trying to resign everybody. I do think most of the times, especially since these are for the most part all Joe Douglas guys, and a lot of the free agents had mild success. I think you'll see a lot of these guys brought back. Like a guy like
Yeah, I
Dan
agree.
Feeney, came in at the end of last year. I thought he looked good at backup center. I'm not saying he's amazing or anything, but it's like, all right, you pay a backup center $2 million. $4 million 2-year deal, whatever it is. Bring him back as some depth because as
I
you see
agree.
every year,
Yeah.
offensive linemen get hurt. Another guy like Keelan Cole. Now I disagree a little bit with the number that he has currently on the simulator. I'm sure a lot of this is going to be updated because they haven't make it 5 million. I've been very against upgrading or bringing back Keelan Cole, but should be noted how good of a blocker he is and how important that is. He's a guy that's been in the system now for a year, has chemistry with Zach, started a few games. He's receiver 5. I'm bringing back Barrios, and Barrios is 4, and then I'm going to add somebody else who's going to be receiver 1. But I still thought I don't think the market for Keelan Cole is going to be crazy. I think you could bring it back for a $3 to $4 million deal. I brought back Joe Flacco because it's not necessarily what I would do, but it sounds like the Jets want to do that. I agree with you on Joyner. I did bring back Croft, but that's not all we're going to make a tight end. I did bring back Tevin Coleman. I think I thought he produced last year. The big issues with him are injuries, so you definitely want to draft somebody. But when he's on the field, Tevin Coleman was fun to watch. I brought back Javon Guidry in the slot next to Michael Carter II. And then I think the last one, or no, I have 2 more. I did bring back Elijah Riley. Again, I think the contract's a little high, but he's getting, I think the perception of him is a little lower because of the whole end of the Buccaneers game, but I thought he came in and played well. He's a strong safety. He's not a free safety, but the Jets don't really have that. So, the safety position going into free agency for me is Elijah Riley, Ashton Davis, and LaMarcus Joyner, which I think is better than, what it could be. But there's a lot of upgrades to be made there. And then the last one, this one is the most questionable. I think all those guys are actually fairly likely to be brought back. Keelan Cole maybe is more up in the air. I brought back LDT. I thought he played well at right guard. I like him there. I didn't sign him to this. Gave him 1 year, $6 million. I would probably do more in the $5 million range. I think you sign him. This is more of, I think they don't re-sign him before free agency starts. You go into free agency, you make your pitch to Brandon Scherr. If you can't get him, then you're in the more of the Tomlinson or one of those other mid-tier guards. You could go after a guy like Austin Corbett or whatever. But I brought back LDT. It says, look, we can draft somebody and start ahead of him, and he can be depth, like he was with KC, or he can start and that you've got a good player. But he's a guy that I wanted back in the locker room. So, sorry, the reason I switched up on you is because all of a sudden I realized I have way more free agents. Any of those guys stand out to you? Why you didn't want to re-sign them? Was it just cap reasons, or you weren't interested in bringing them back?
No, I think I'd agree with most of them. I think the only one that might not get brought back is Croft, because I feel like they might really emphasize tight end and focus on revitalizing it. They'll have a good opportunity to draft 1 or 2. Maybe they'll sign a bigger free agent.
Yeah, who
It
said
could absolutely happen, though.
who said I wasn't gonna revitalize tight end? Me bringing back
I have some
Croft.
plans too. I got some plans too. But I think Croft is like that ideal tight end too. Like decent receiver, good blocker. He wasn't quite that this year because he dropped a lot more passes than he usually does, and wasn't really as good of a blocker as he usually is. But I can see him coming back. But the rest of them, yeah, I think there will be a lot of re-signs. I think all these guys, all the players you mentioned, if brought back on an affordable deal, can absolutely fulfill a depth role on this team.
Let's get to free agency. You mentioned Tyler Croft. You started at tight end, so let's start there. That's a big need for this team. Everybody wants to see the Jets at a tight end. I mean, how could you not? Especially not just watching San Francisco's offense with George Kittle, but even a guy like Travis Kelce. I mean, it's just like that guy is so damn good, and he's just always open in the clutchest spots. If the Bills had a tight end that was even close to the level of Travis Kelce, I'm not saying he has to be Travis Kelce, but if they had somebody even close to, I know they have Dawson Knox, but I'm talking like a legitimate, give him like Zach Ertz, they win that game. I mean, a great tight end changes so much for you. It's a great tight end class in the draft, and I think there's a lot of good free agent names. I went after the guy everybody talking about, who I've been talking about since like August. I texted Michael about Dalton Schultz. I offered him a deal, and Dalton Schultz left me at the altar. He did not accept. So I had to pivot a little bit. I'm curious, Michael, your strategy for tight end before I reveal who I ultimately signed.
Well, I also agree with your plan. I think I'm one of the, and credit to you, like you said, I think you mentioned him before the year. So you were one of the founders of the Dalton Schultz fan club, but I'm now one of the leading members of that fan club, I think. And I did make an offer to Dalton Schultz, but thankfully he accepted my deal. He's a New York Jet in my simulation.
I guess you just You're more charismatic than me, Michael. I should
I
have brought
guess so.
cupcakes. I should have brought
I was just
cupcakes.
gonna say that
Wow.
you had to bring cupcakes.
Great minds, great minds. Okay, so I wasn't able to get a guy like Dalton Schultz, and I looked at the draft, and obviously there's a few guys that might become draft sweethearts, but I said I think what the free agency market brings, and I kind of blended maybe what I would do a little bit with what I think Joe Douglas might do. If they swing and a miss on a guy like Dalton Schultz, I think a guy like David Njoku makes a lot of sense. And hear me out for a second.
I agree. But go ahead.
Joe Douglas has, if you look at a lot of his free agent signings, look at George Fant, Gerard Davis last year, maybe 1 for 2 on those. He likes taking a chance on those high ceiling project guys who have flashed but haven't really been consistent, signing them to a 1 year deal and just seeing if you could crack them. And I think David Njoku in this system could do a lot of damage. Now, obviously, he's more of a receiver, but make no mistake about it, his blocking got a lot better this past season. I really like it. He's 24. He's young. You bring him in on a 1 or 2 year deal. You're not done at that position. He's not necessarily tight end number one off the bat, but he's a great weapon. At the very worst, you're getting a guy who's going to help Zach Wilson out in the passing game. And I brought back Tyler Kroft, so you have maybe a better blocker there. But I like Njoku's effort as a blocker. I think he's gotten a lot better in that regard. The one detraction there is if the Jets are going to run 12 personnel and Njoku's getting beat on the blocks, he might be a guy who doesn't play. That's why you give him a 1 year deal. But I like taking a swing on him. I mean, there's other guys like CJ Uzama, or you could go with OJ Howard. There's plenty of different tight ends. I think Dalton Schultz is the clear number one. It does depend what he gets offered, though. I mean, while I was the founder maybe of the fan club, his fan club has certainly grown to a point where I think people are trying to throw $14 million at him. And he's a good tight end. He's always open. But there's a line in the sand, certainly, for Dalton Schultz. But for me, I did try to offer him, and he declined. So I went with David Njoku. I introduced one of let me start with this. How many free agents did you ultimately sign? Just so I know where to.
Outside free agents, I got 7.
Okay. So why don't I give you the floor here? Talk about maybe a free agent you brought in and why.
All right. So I actually went with the unique approach at the guard position. And this actually isn't something I've done before doing this, but I want to mix it up this time. So I did not re-sign LDT, and I guess I could have just for depth purposes. I probably should have, but I want to go a different direction with guard. I decided to make a play for one of the bigger names, and I got Connor Williams from Dallas. So another Cowboy coming into our offense. He played left guard, has played in the NFL, so he'd have to switch sides. But he was really good this past season. He had a breakout year. He's only 24, allowed the third fewest pressures among all guards in the league, among qualified guards. So I think, and he seems like a scheme fit. So I think that making a play for a guard is something that they could do. And there are multiple options. There's Scherf, like you mentioned, Connor Williams, Tomlinson from San Francisco, who obviously has experience with the floor and in the scheme. So there are Austin Corbett. So there are 4 options right there of, I think, very good top tier guards who they could go after. That is something that could be in play. So that is the lane that I took here to fill out that guard spot.
I thoroughly like going after a guy like Connor Williams or Austin Corb. With LDT, I figured those guys declined me, if I'm being honest. And so I figured those guys were going to decline me. So I went with LDT. But I do not hate that at all. As I said, I think they're really going to emphasize trying to upgrade on the offensive line, even if it does seem like, a guy like LDT played well. I would not hate that at all. I definitely don't disagree with that. I guess I'll go here. And you have more than me. I should mention. Let's get them out of the way. We've done tight end. The other obvious need is safety. I signed Marcus Williams. I think this is the most no-brainer signing for the Jets this offseason. I think, one, you look at the Saints, I don't see how they re-sign him. And look, they've worked some salary cap magic the last few years, so maybe they figure something out. I just don't see how they re-sign him, especially a safety. They're not going to pay him what he deserves. He is a fantastic player, a consistent player, a guy who's been healthy. Yes, he was involved in the Minnesota Miracle, or whatever people are calling it, in the playoffs. But Marcus Williams is a hell of a player. I love the way he would project to a scheme like this. I think they would pay up for him. I think you pay up for him. We'll see what they do at the other safety spot, but I think he's a no-brainer. And it's a good safety class. You mentioned a few guys, but Marcus Williams is the cream of the crop. The Jets have the assets to get him, and I just don't see a way that he doesn't hit the open market.
Yeah, I also signed Marcus Williams. I think he's a dream signing for them. A great single high safety. Probably maybe has a case for being the best, single high deep safety in the league. Great in coverage, doesn't make many mistakes at all. And that's what they need. That's really what safety is all about. As much as it's about making big plays, interceptions, deflections, and all that, it's just about executing your role, winning the mind game with the quarterback, and just not giving him opportunities to make big plays. That's what I think Buffalo's safeties do so well. With Poyer and Micah Hyde, they just have so much continuity. They played together for so many years. They're fundamentally sound, and that's why the Bills every single year give up the fewest big plays in the league by far, because they just execute their roles. And I think that's what Marcus Williams does really well, and he would stabilize a defense that is young and made a lot of mistakes last year. So I think he'll be worth the big contract that he will likely get. There will be plenty of suitors for him, but I think, like we said, safety is probably the Jets' most desperate need on defense. So I think they will make a big play and be leading contenders for him.
Yeah, safety and linebacker always seems to get undervalued by people. People say safeties aren't important or linebacker. How could you pay a linebacker $19 million? There's referring to CJ Mosley. Obviously, that's a fair takeaway. But you look at the best defense in the league. Where are they elite at? Safety linebacker. They're not elite anywhere else. They play elite as a unit, but just individual position groups, where are they amazing? That the middle of their defense. It's those linebackers and those safeties. They swarm everything. I mean, and it is maybe not the exact same, but it is a similar defense to what the Jets are trying to do, in the sense of you watch them, they play as just one unit. I mean, there's a 5-yard slant that's caught. 7 blue jerseys are around that receiver. Or it's like, they're playing a cover 4. It's like every man is just so disciplined to each of their zones. And it really comes down to their linebacker and safety play. I mean, they lost the best corner in football, arguably the best corner in football, in Tre'Davious White, and they didn't really miss a beat. I mean, it comes down to their safety and linebacker play. So, yeah, I think the Jets should go all in on paying a guy like Marcus Williams. Speaking of linebacker, I know there's a few guys that you're interested in. Did you sign any of the premier linebackers? I did think about it. I tried. I did not have any success. I know you've mentioned a few guys. I poked around in this area. I didn't end up pulling the trigger.
Yeah, I went with a lower tier option at linebacker, who I think is going to be fairly affordable, but is a starting caliber player. I went with AJ Johnson from the Broncos. His name is interesting. Sometimes it's Alexander Johnson, sometimes it's AJ Johnson, depending where you look. But he was coming off a big injury, so that might drive his price down a little bit. But when he's been healthy, he's been really solid. And he is up there in age. He's 30, but he has been a very solid starter the last 3 years when healthy. So I went with the lower cost option here, sort of a veteran stopgap starter, but he has has not missed many tackles, been solid in coverage. So I think he could be a nice competition piece. So this is one of the positions where I'm kind of taking a step back a little bit, not being too aggressive, because obviously you can't just be extremely aggressive at every single position. You got to be realistic. Some needs you can't address as aggressively as others. So linebacker is one of them for me, even though I think that they should explore it. But I like AJ Johnson as a little stopgap option here, who can start this year and I think be an upgrade.
I looked at the defensive tackle spot, and by the way, I agree everything you said. I did not pull the trigger. I did look at. I'm gonna butcher his name, so you might have to help me. But it's Foyesade Aluakon, I think, who had 150 tackles this year for Atlanta, who's played under Ulbrich. I think he's certainly a guy to look at. Devondre Campbell in Green Bay, another guy who racked up a bunch of tackles. Both guys who are intriguing. I looked around at them. I didn't pull the trigger. Also, Keanu Neal, who's another free agent who the Jets were, battling neck and neck with the Cowboys. So I think those are all guys who make sense. I didn't sign any of them in my offseason simulator. I looked at defensive tackle, and I went with one of my other free agency crushes and Larry Ogunjobi, who I think obviously he suffered the knee injury. I think he should be okay. I think it's a perfect scheme fit as far as you want an attacking defensive tackle, pass rushing defensive tackle. I cut Sheldon Rankins, but there's still a hole there. I mean, the Jets want to be deep here. I don't think the Jets mind paying starter money to a guy who might be technically a backup. Because one, with injuries, he's probably going to end up starting, and two, when you look at the snap counts when it's all said and done, he's going to be playing quite a bit. I went and got Larry Ogunjobi. I thought third down pass rusher, whatever the situation is, he's a guy you can put on the field. Super aggressive, really fun player, good locker room guy, high character. What did you think about defensive tackle? Because let me talk you through my process here. I almost went with DJ Jones, who I don't know if you ultimately went with, who is the run stuffer from San Francisco. Obviously a good scheme fit, had a fantastic year. I almost went with him because I was thinking, okay, you replace Foley Fatukasi, you get your first and second down run stuffer, and then on third down you have JFM kick inside, and you got JFM and Quinnen on third down next to each other. And then obviously you either have Bryce Huff there at edge or somebody you draft, whatever. So the run stuffer, paying the run stuffer might make more sense. But I just looked at Ogunjobi. I did try to sign both of them. DJ Jones did not accept. I looked at Ogunjobi and I just said, that's a guy that I'm just going to take Rankin's money and pay him to. I'm going to bring him in immediately. I'll worry about edge in the draft. Spoiler alert. But I just really love what he brings as a pass rusher. And, you have the opportunity to kind of play Quinnen Williams in more of the role that maybe you would be giving to DJ Jones. Obviously, Quinnen's a great pass rusher as well, but he has some of those run stuffing capabilities. So I thought there's a lot of different fun things the Jets could do with Ogunjobi. I think he's a player that they're definitely going to go after. But I'm curious what you did at defensive tackle.
Yeah, I actually did go with DJ Jones. He did accept my deal. But I see where you're coming from as well. But I decided to go with the sort of the run stuffer route. Ogunjobi gives you a little bit more on the pass rushing side. And I think you could even go with both, like you said, if both Fatukasi and Rankins leave. So that is an option as well. But I decided to go with DJ Jones here.
I tried. I'm not going to lie to the viewers here, but DJ Jones.
I think I was doing a really good job with my recruiting in this. I don't think anyone declined any of my offers in this, which is very rare because usually I think it's probably about 50-50, which I think is cool because it gives you that realistic, it allows you to go through in a more realistic sense where you can't just do everything you want. Right. So, but everyone was accepting me this time. So it's just that Robert Saleh appeal, I guess. But I went with DJ Jones. I think he has experience playing under Saleh in the scheme, has shown he could stop the run in a 4-3. He tied for the lead among interior D linemen this year in run stops. Is having a great playoff so far. So I'm going to go with him, but there are different avenues you can go between run stuffing, pass rushing. There's some good options.
I have to say, I love now that we've talked about it, and I kind of just did it on a whim, but now that we've expanded on it, I love the idea of signing both Ogunjobi and DJ Jones, especially if you're not going to trade up for a guy like Kayvon or Hutchinson or hope they fall, or maybe you take a guy like Karlaftis. But let's just say the Jets don't address edge high in the draft, and they don't really love any of the edge prospects in free agency to sign. It's like, okay, you go ahead and sign Ogunjobi and DJ Jones. I think that helps your pass rush tremendously. You take that. I mean, the money combined between the two of them is like paying for one elite pass rusher. But like what you said, it's like they were going to have to pay Foley Fatukasi and Sheldon Rankins anyways. So you're subbing those two guys out, and you could still go address edge, the second round of the draft, or maybe trade down and pick 10 or whatever it is. But I just like the idea of really infusing that defensive line with some depth, and you can do a lot of fun things. I mean, you can go first down, you can have JFM, DJ Jones, Quinnen, and Carl Lawson, and then on third down, maybe it's Ogunjobi next to JFM, or maybe it's Quinnen next to Ogunjobi, or whatever it is. I think there's a lot of fun things you can do. I think going Ogunjobi and DJ Jones. I'm not going to change what happened in mine. I think that's a good strategy. Now, looking at corner, this is the last free agent I actually signed. I went a little light on the free agents. Podcast was about to start. I kind of sped through it a little bit. I went heavier on the re-sign, building through the draft. At corner, this is a position that I do think the Jets. I can't really get a read because, like you said, this is the one position they could punt on. Maybe not punt. Maybe punt's the bad word, but it's like look at San Francisco. They've never really had elite corners outside of Richard Sherman, and they've had a good defense. And even this year, their cornerback play really hurt them, and here they are in the NFC Championship. So maybe they won't go after a corner. I was kind of thinking about when Robert Saleh brought in Richard Sherman, and I was thinking, if they could just sign a veteran, put him aside Bryce Hall. You could still draft another guy, but I just think you could really solidify that corner spot because I really like Bryce Hall, but I like him as a cornerback too. I'm not saying he can't necessarily be a cornerback one, but I like him at cornerback two. I think they need somebody opposite him. At the very least, even if you're saying Bryce Hall's cornerback one, I don't think Eccles is cornerback two just because he played cornerback two this year. So I went and signed Stephon Gilmore. He accepted. I went and got a relatively big free agent. I tried J.C. Jackson, who there's a chance, you never know, former Patriot. And it should be noted that on the Michael Kay show, when they asked Zach Wilson, who was somebody that really stuck out to you as being an amazing football player that you played against, he said J.C. Jackson. I mean, no wonder he did throw, 14 interceptions that game. But it should be noted that, hey, if J.C. Jackson shakes free, wouldn't necessarily surprise me. Even though I know he got shredded by Diggs in the playoff game. But he declined. Jackson declined. So I just tried Stephon Gilmore. He accepted. I said, okay, we'll roll with it. I kind of thought of him like, okay, he's my Richard Sherman. You give him a 1 or 2 year deal. It buys you some time to develop the other corners. And what I think it also kind of does is it helps you develop the rest of your defense if you're going to try to build them through the draft. Because if you have good cornerback play, I think that allows your defensive linemen and your linebackers to develop, because it's like, not saying this will necessarily happen, but if the Jets were rolling out Hall and Eccles again, or Eccles gets hurt or whatever it is, and you just have one corner who's just continuously getting beat, I don't care what scheme you're playing. I mean, it's like a good quarterback is just going to shred you apart. He's going to get the ball out of his hands every 2 seconds. So I went and upgraded the cornerback spot. I may go back on that. Obviously, there's a few months to go, but I thought, all right, I'll be bold here. I bought a secondary. I bought Marcus Williams and Stephon Gilmore, pairing them with Bryce Hall, Michael Carter. Obviously, we could use another safety. For right now, it's the Marcus Joyner. But I like the state of my defense. Now, Michael, I know you have a few more free agents. I'm done. So feel free to go off on the free agents you did sign. And then let's talk about maybe some of the holes that we still have entering the draft.
Yeah, I only have 2 more. They're smaller signings. I went with the kicker and Dustin Hopkins to compete with Eddie Pinheiro. I think they should get another kicker in there just for competition. And I signed Raheem Mostert, I think, to add some speed to the running back room. So that does it for my free agent class. I did not sign a corner. I did punt on it, as you mentioned before, which again is probably would be a controversial thing if they did do it, but I could see it as a possibility. It's definitely something that is probably the biggest risk of what I'm doing here. But,
they did it last year when it was a bigger risk.
Exactly. So that's what I'm going to do here. It's not something I'm necessarily proud of or advocating for, but that is the path that I take here at the corner.
Now, when we look at our teams, which holes do you still see entering the draft? Because you don't really want to enter the draft with a shopping list. You don't really want to enter, but you can, especially when you're picking at the top of the draft, when you have 2 picks in the top 10, you can kind of lay out, all right, we should be able to get these 2 positions if the board falls the way we think it will. But outside of that, you really don't want to go into the draft with too many glaring needs. And if you are, you shouldn't try to plug them all. What needs do you have on your team, would you say?
Well, cornerback is definitely one. I didn't address the edge yet. Also haven't gotten that big receiver yet. Obviously, all we're doing here is just kind of spoiling our draft plans. But yeah, I would say edge. Receiver,
not necessarily.
Some more safety help.
I'm not saying what you're going to address in the draft. I'm just saying you look at the holes.
I think this is an honest critique, and I'm not completely spoiling it, because I am saying that one of these needs that I listed, I didn't address in the draft. So I guess that is how I would sum it up. Corner, we could still, obviously I didn't do anything there. We didn't get that big time receiver. Could still use another starting edge rusher, try to upgrade that, move Franklin Myers inside. Only got 1 tight end, obviously the tight end one, but can get that tight end 2 spot nailed down. Only got 1 starting safety. So there's interior D-line, could get a second piece there, since I did not re-sign Vadakasi. So plenty of holes still left to fill as we enter the draft.
Before we get into the draft, is there anything you like or dislike about my team? I'll go first on yours. I think the one thing that I look at your team that I think makes a lot of sense that maybe I would do is I went with LDT just because I was in the re-sign phase and I brought him back. But I could see the Jets paying big for a guy like Corbett, Austin Corbett, if he shakes for you. Sure, for in your example, use Connor Williams. Are they upgrades over LDT? Probably. I think Williams is a little closer, but I would not be surprised to see the Jets go and spend at guard, because even if you draft a tackle at 4 then you have a abundance of riches there of deciding who's going to be on the bench between Fant, Becton, and your rookie, and you don't have to worry about trying to play one at guard, whatever it is. I really liked that move there, and obviously the kicker. I forgot completely about going and signing a kicker. I was flying through this a little bit, and I like how you dress linebacker. So there's a few good things. If I were you, though, I think I probably would have addressed corner. Even if you're not going to go Gilmore, if you go with a guy like Xavier Rhodes or just somebody kind of middle of the pack, just a veteran body, just anybody.
Yeah.
And then you could worry about drafting a guy on day 2 or day 3 to kind of round out the group. I think that is probably the most likely thing, is signing a Pierre Desir type of free agent. Not saying Pierre Desir, but I'm just saying like that type of middle of the road free agent and drafting a guy makes a lot of sense for this unit.
Yeah, that's fair.
Anything on mine?
I think, well, you struck out on Dalton Schultz, so I would just say, like I was going to say earlier, just try to improve your recruiting process. Maybe get some cupcakes in there. He's a Utah guy. Maybe get Zach Wilson in the room for a pitch meeting. Talk about Utah. I don't know. Try to connect with him on his level a little bit. These are some of the strategies I used in my pitch meeting.
If I had to put money in the 2 most likely free agents, it's Marcus Williams and Dalton Schultz. I mean, that's just safety, tight end, 2 huge needs, top of the class in each of them. Jets have the assets.
But I mean, last year we would put Carl Lawson in that category. We were putting Carl Lawson in that category all off season, and they did end up getting him. So
we put Carl Lawson. No. We put Carl Lawson in the category of can't get him. I don't know if you misheard me or if you're misremembering, but Carl Lawson was the guy like, oh, he's not going to shake free. He's going to get franchise tagged. And then he didn't get franchise tagged, and the Jets somehow got him. But I remember all offseason.
Right, yeah.
No, I remember all offseason. It was like, he's going to get franchise tagged. Like, he was just one of those guys when you look at these simulators or whatever, like a Devontae Adams, where it's like, all right, well, he's not a free agent, and then he's shuck free. A guy like Lawson, especially, who didn't even get the franchise tag, it was always surprising. And then look, it's worked out for him. Hendrickson has been good. Hendrickson was a guy who's rumored to maybe the Jets were maybe interested in, but they went with Lawson. I don't think you can criticize that move at the moment, because I think that Carl Lawson would have had an equally as amazing season as Hendrickson has had if he didn't get hurt, but he has to prove that this next year. All right, let's get into the draft. We're just going to do 3 rounds. We're not going to do all of them. We don't know enough yet, and we don't want to just start shopping for groceries. Let's start at the top. I'll make this very clear. I wanted to trade up to number 1 and get Kayvon. That was what I wanted to do. The way the simulator is set up right now, you can't really do that at the start of the draft. I think maybe I maybe could have if I did it right at the beginning, but by the time I was on the clock, I couldn't. So I would have liked to have traded up for Kayvon, and then you could look at number 10. You trade down there, and you recuperate whatever you give up. If you give up one of the 2s to move up with Jacksonville, who would presumably only trade down with the idea of taking a tackle, you could then move down from 10 to wherever you're going to move down, and you could recuperate that, and voila, you got the best player in the draft, and there's still a lot of guys in the teens. But at number 4, I took Ike Ekwonu, who I have as the best offensive lineman in this draft. I think he's better than Evan Neal. I think he's a perfect scheme fit. He fits this wide zone perfectly well. I love the idea of putting him on offensive line with Mekhi Becton. I think he is a absolute dominant run blocker and a very good pass blocker as well. When I see Evan Neal, and I know, Michael, you were getting some of the same takeaways, and I'm no offensive line expert, but even just listen to the guys like Brandon Thorne, who is an offensive line expert. I watched Evan Neal, and I see a guy who seems off balance and lunging and relying too much on his hands. I mean, you see the ceiling there. You see a guy who's like, okay, well, he could develop into a superstar left tackle, but he's not a sure thing right out of the gate. And he's also a guy who, a lot of Jets fans have this idea of drafting one of these tackles and moving him inside, which I think makes a lot of sense with Ekwonu. I think right away you could play him at guard. How many 6'7" guards do you have if you're going to put Evan Neal inside? I mean, that isn't a reason to choose one over the other. But I think Ekwonu is the better player, has the higher ceiling. I like his versatility. And the one question I will give to you with Ekwonu while we're on the topic, where would you play him? If they take a guy, you could throw Evan Neal. If you take an offensive tackle at 4, where are you playing them year 1? Are you putting him at right tackle and sitting Fant or Becton and moving one of them inside? Are you putting Becton at right tackle, Ekwonu at right tackle, and bang, you got 2 of the best run blockers right next to each other? You're just going to, bulldoze everybody. Do you put Ekwonu and Becton on other sides? I mean, how would you try to reconfigure that offensive line if you did bring in a guy like Ekwonu? I don't know your pick, so maybe you did take him. But even if you didn't, um, where do you see him playing year one in an ideal world of what could maximize the Jets matchups?
I did not go with Ekwonu, but I agree with your take on him being a more impressive prospect than Neal, at least from what I've seen. And again, not that our opinions are not the end all be all on offensive line, but at least from what I've seen, just he's more fluid, moves better, takes better angles, uses his hands better. When I watched Neal, I saw a lot of lunging, and just kind of not being able to set his feet well and engage blockers with proper angles. And defenders were really able to easily anticipate how he was going to approach them and just sidestep him, swim over him. He was never able to consistently get good grips on blockers. Although when he did get into them, then you could see the potential, how good he could be. With Neal, I think I'd be less optimistic about him at guard. 6'7" guard, like you said, is kind of rare, not necessarily ideal, especially the quarterback in Wilson, who is not short, but he's also not super tall. I think Ekwonu would be a better fit at guard. It would be interesting for the Jets what they would do with that, because they're in this unique position where there are these two great tackle prospects up there that they could take. Obviously, they could still improve their offensive line, but the Jets also have two great tackles of their own in Becton and George Fant, who you anticipate will both be coming back. So it will be interesting. I don't think either is as guaranteed of like the way Vera Tucker moved into guard last year. I think that was more clear that he could do that because when he played it, he was actually really good. Whereas not that Neal and Ekwonu were bad there, but they were clearly their best at tackle. So I think it would be a little bit more of a projection. But I think you could be comfortable drafting Ekwonu and putting him at guard. I just think the question is, would you do that with the fourth pick? Because that would obviously be a little bit of a, taking a guard number 4 is pretty rare, and you would have to be confident that he'd be very good.
I think the thing with Ekwonu is I don't think I would have him as my long-term guard. I think you would take him year one, you play him at guard. And look, if he's amazing, if he's Quentin Nelson at guard, then maybe he is your guard. If you do play him at guard and Fant is good and Becton's good and they all stay healthy and they're great, then it's like, all right, are you going to really complain about taking an elite guy at guard at 4? I don't think the Colts are complaining of taking a guy at 6 at guard.
Right.
But long term, he's a guy that you can move out to tackle. Now, the only question I do have, I think he's a great player. The only question I do have is he's only played the left side. So while he's a great scheme fit, he's only played left guard and left tackle. So are you moving AVT over to right guard and putting him at left guard, and then that way he could play next to Becton? AVT is a guy who has played right guard, but again, AVT had success at left guard. Maybe you don't want to mess with that. So maybe you keep AVT at left guard, and then it's like, okay, well, we're going to play him at right tackle or right guard. And then it's like, he could struggle if he's right out of the gates trying to play a new side. So maybe you try to move him inside, and it's like, well, I'd rather see him next to Becton than Fant. So you move in Becton over to right tackle. It does get a little complicated with the Jets taking a tackle. But as far as best player available, as far as where do we want to, invest the offensive line, the trenches, I think Ekwonu is a Pro Bowl, all pro type of player. I think then at that point, assuming Becton stays healthy, you have 3 young guys with all pro potential. And I think that's exactly the type of offensive line Joe Douglas wants. So that's why with Ekwonu, I did consider in another world, I would have tried to trade up and get Kayvon. But if I'm going to stay at 4, I thought about Kyle Hamilton. I'm not as against taking a safety, but I already paid Marcus Williams. I think Ekwonu makes the most sense. Now, who did you take it for?
I went with George Karlaftis. I think he can really complete the defense in terms of being able to take that edge spot opposite Carl Lawson. I think he's a more natural fit than Franklin Myers there, who's very solid on the edges here. I think Franklin Myers is a fantastic edge setter at his size with his strength. And he just has such great pass rush technique that he wins a lot. It's just that when he does win, it doesn't make as great of an effect as a better athlete, a more explosive athlete, smaller, faster player can make, because, he is pretty big for a defensive end out there. And, he isn't able to get home as quickly as Carl Lawson might be able to. So he's a very good edge rusher, but I think on the inside, that's where he's a plus athlete, where he's going up against guards, he's closer to the quarterback. That's where he can get home very quickly. And I think we saw that in 2020. He was a much more destructive pass rusher than he was this year. He was still good this year, but in 2020, he was a legit, in terms of how frequently he's creating pressure, he was an elite pass rusher in 2020 for a defensive tackle. So I think you draft Karlaftis, Franco Myers can come back inside next to Quinnen, and Karlaftis can sort of mimic a lot of the things that Franco Myers does in terms of setting the edge, being able to handle those responsibilities, having the size and strength to do that. But he also does have, I think, a little bit more juice and bend than a Franco Myers would. Doesn't have an elite amount of that, obviously, in comparison to some of the other prospects at the top of this class. But for, I think, his size and frame and strength, he does have a good amount of it and can kind of give the Jets the complete player that I think they want on the edge opposite Carl Lawson, who's obviously your pass rush guy, that star defensive end, mainly for the pass rushing. Karlaftis can be that complete player on the other side. And I think with Franco Myers being there in his role in all of this, you can really complete that defense by selecting him. There are a lot of avenues here, but I like the domino effect that comes with Karlaftis.
I really want to love Karlaftis because I think it's like that is probably the biggest need. If you could choose any position to address in the top 5 for the Jets in terms of need and where they want to invest, it would be edge. Absolutely. That's why it is a bummer that they're not in Kayvon and Hutchinson Terry at the time. We'll see who falls. I do like Karlaftis. I think he is quite the technician. I love, I think he has a great repertoire of moves. He has been dominant at getting pressure. That Ohio State film is rough. If you go and watch that, I mean, you don't want to judge a player just off one game, but that was really not a good game for him. Let's just be honest. I mean, he looked athletically limited. People call him the Greek freak as a joke, and that's what it is. That is a joke to call him that because he's not athletically freakish. He's a good athlete, but how he wins is his technique. I mean, he's a strong kid and he's 20, but it's not like he has crazy length and crazy burst and flexibility. I mean, he can play stiff, but he's very technically sound. That's why everybody compares him to another Boilermaker and Ryan Kerrigan. So I wouldn't hate him. I felt that at taking him at 4, I was maybe passing on a guy like, I think Kyle Hamilton's a blue chip player. And am I going to pass on him for a guy? And Carl After said, I'm not sure. I think Ekwonu is a blue chip player. Am I going to pass on him for a guy that I'm not sure? So I went with who I thought was the best player at the positions I want to invest in, and that was Ekwonu. At 10,
I do agree with your concerns. A lot of what I'm saying about Karlaftis is not necessarily hypothetical. I do believe all of it, but definitely watching him, I feel like he didn't pop as much as, like you said, Ekwonu. He didn't really pop out to me as much as I wanted to, but I can see where he fits into this defense really well. I think from a fit perspective, he's probably the best option because, again, with Ekwonu, there's a little bit more, shuffling with the positions, changing sides. Same thing with Evan Neal. So I think Karlaftis is probably the best fit. So that's why I go with him, but I definitely am a little bit skeptical of, is he a number 4 talent? I am a little bit skeptical of that, but I think with considering fit, I think he's the best option.
all right, let's move to number 10. And I think mentioning the OSU film is a good segue here for my pick here at 10. Again, I wanted to trade up from 4 and trade down from 10, and I still could have technically traded down from 10, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to stick at 4 and 10. I have gone back and forth on who I love at the receiver position. And I should say, not even receiver. I think there's a lot of guys in this range that I would be happy with the Jets taking. I think there's more options at 10 that I like than there are options at 4 that I like, in the sense that I think there's a wider variety of areas the Jets could go. Maybe a guy like Karlaftis falls, or maybe they go and take a guy like Ojabo, who's maybe not a direct scheme fit in year 1, but he can play that D Ford role. And, you just see, I mean, he's just oozing with potential. He's a guy that you play that D4 role year one and add some weight, and maybe he's a starter by year two. So you could go with a guy like that. You could go with the linebacker position. Kobe Dean has been an absolute stud, and he seems like a guy the Jets could very easily fall in love with. The Jets are getting to coach Devin Lloyd, another linebacker in the Senior Bowl. Maybe Saleh falls in love with him there. I mean, Tyler Linderbaum has a case to be he is a top 10 player in this draft, but he's a center. So does that not, a lot of people are against taking a center at 10. But when I watched this weekend, specifically when I was watching the Bengals the last 2 weekends, it's just you see what elite receiver play can do for a young quarterback. I wasn't just going to reach to take a receiver. I really wasn't. I was going to go with maybe trade down, take a Linderbaum or a linebacker. But after watching Garrett Wilson, I think he's the guy. I think out of all the receivers, I think he's my favorite. And it's in terms of scheme fit and what he can bring for Zach Wilson, I think he's a legit stud. I mean, I think he is that Stephon Diggs or that Justin Jefferson, or I think he's just a guy that comes in year one. I mean, and thrives. And I think he brings something that the Jets don't already have, but yet he fits exactly what they're looking for. I mean, I think he is a superstar route runner. He's incredibly athletic. He can go and win those jump balls, although he didn't do it a crazy amount. He's not a Drake London, but he can go up and get the ball. But for him, he wins with the separation. And not only is separation, not only does he have crazy separation every play, which is the biggest determiner in terms of if a guy is going to be successful from college to the NFL, you want the guys who can separate. I mean, just watch Cooper Kupp. The guy's wide open in every play. Not only is he wide open in every play, not only if you just watch any Ohio State game, do they throw to, despite having Chris Olave, does it seems like Garrett Wilson is if it's third down, we're going to Garrett Wilson. Not only does he have that, he's awesome after the catch. I mean, he's a guy that you can catch a 10-yard curl and take it 85 yards. So I really love Garrett Wilson. I think, again, the defense is has maybe more needs, but it's like you watch all these games, especially that Bills Chiefs game. It's like, just go and put the best offense possible on the field. Go drown your rookie quarterback in talent. And I love Garrett Wilson. That I questioned taking receiver at 10 because generally receivers are a pretty deep position. But I love this player and I want to surround Zach Wilson with talent. So I think in an ideal world, maybe you trade down, take him, Dean, Linder, but whatever. But right now, sticking at 10, I go with my gut. I'll go with Garrett Wilson.
I'm on the exact same page as you. I also went with the wide receiver. You laid out a great case for Garrett Wilson. I went with Treylon Burks here. A lot of the same reasons that you mentioned, just in terms of what we're trying to accomplish for the team with getting wide receiver. I really like the upside with Burks, just in terms of having a guy who has a lot of size, but also is someone who can have the ball schemed into his hands, lined up in the backfield, got end arounds, things like that, and can make plays with the ball in his hands. Just reminds you of that, Deebo Samuel sort of player, a guy who is, who can have touches schemed for him, but isn't necessarily just a small, quick guy. He also has a lot of size and can get down the field and make contested catches, things like that. He really does have the tools, I think, to be that, superstar kind of player. I think there's a little bit more risk with him compared to some of the other prospects just because of, like separation, things like that, which you just talked about, which is very important. But in terms of taking a swing for a guy who could really be a game changer, I think Burks might have the most upside, but I could absolutely see Garrett Wilson, like you mentioned. I think this is a good spot if they stay put at number 10. I think they have quite a few options in terms of if they want to find that top wide receiver prospect. I go with Burks here, but I think we both have the same goal with this pick.
I think in 3 different podcasts, I've had 3 different wide receiver ones. I was originally on the Jameson Williams train and the Treylon Burks and the Garrett Wilson. The truth is I love all of them. I think they're great players. I think Garrett Wilson is the best natural scheme fit, and he's the one that after watching him, I'm the most confident that he's going to hit. I mean, I just watch him and it's like, okay, that guy is wide open every single play. His route running is at an elite level already. A Treylon Burks I love. He's exciting. I love guys who they have just weird statistics about him. Like Treylon Burks has that statistic where it's like, or that fact about him where they had to make him custom gloves because his hands are so big. Like I love that. And the Jets don't really have that jump ball receiver. And Zach Wilson, you saw it at BYU. He likes those jump ball guys. And like you said, they can use Burks in a lot of different ways. You can put him in the slot and keep Corey Davis at the Z and Elijah Moore at the X, and you can put him at X. And hell, you could put Traylon Burks at H back and give him end around. I mean, you could Mike LaFleur could have a lot of fun with Traylon Burks. So it's very tempting. I thought about him a lot. This is again why I would say trade down from 10, recuperate some picks, and I guarantee either Garrett Wilson's going to be there or Traylon Burks or Jacoby Dean, Devin Lloyd, Linderbaum. Somebody is going to be there, and you can pick up an extra pick. If you love one of these guys, that's a different story. But I have all these guys similarly. I think Garrett Wilson's the guy I'm the most confident in. But I love that pick, Michael. I think it's a fun draft you have right now, but it is a risky one.
Thank you.
Looking into the second round, again, 2 huge picks here. This is a guy that I'm not sure would necessarily fall. I'll be honest. I think he's a first rounder, so I should preface that. But he was there, so I'm not gonna pass him. Jermaine Johnson, the edge rusher from Florida State. I think he's a guy that goes in the first round, but he was there, and so I was going to take him. And I like the idea of just loading the defensive line. 2 of my first 3 picks are in the trenches, which I think is in line with what Saleh and Douglas wants to do. And even if you include Garrett Wilson, they want to protect Zach Wilson. So I think all 3 of my picks have kind of stayed in line, or surround Zach Wilson with talent. All 3 of my picks have stayed in line with what the Jets' messages have been. I think this is a good spot for an edge rusher. I think there is a chance that Johnson falls. Even a guy like Sanders from Cincinnati, if he's still there and Johnson's not, and his stock rises a little bit, I think this is a good opportunity for them to take a guy who you can rotate in at that edge rusher. He's a guy who maybe does start for you if you really like him. He was a dominant training camp, but he's also a guy that you could bring off the bench and put him in situationally and kind of ease him into that role. Jermaine Johnson, I think, is a guy you could start from day one. But that's where I went. I went with the edge. There was a lot of different places. You got to be careful not to position shop, but he was not only the best player on the board, but a huge need for me. So I went with him.
I'm going with Trey McBride here with my first pick of the second round, tight end from Colorado State. Obviously, we signed Dalton Schultz, committed to him, but this is supposed to be a 12 personnel offense, and I don't think there's any harm in getting a second tight end prospect, a second premium investment at tight end in there, and just try to get as many weapons, as much blocking talent as possible in the building. I think he has that 2-way ability that they're looking for in terms of blocking and receiving. Low drop rate, good pass protection numbers, good contested catch numbers, really does have a complete package of things to offer. So I go with Trey McBride here.
I will just piggyback off you because my next second round pick, McBride, was still there. So I went and took McBride, who was a guy who I would definitely consider 35. Look, it's tough because if he has an amazing Senior Bowl, he might sneak into the end of round 1. But if he has a good Senior Bowl, I think he's a very likely candidate for that pick in round 2. And it's a very good tight end class. I know a lot of guys have fallen in love with McBride, but Ruckert, Weidemeyer, Isaiah Likely, there's a lot of really good tight ends that I would be happy with. If you don't go with McBride and you go and sign a guy like, for example, in your plan, if you have Dalton Schultz, maybe you do take a swing on a guy like Jalen Weidemeyer, who brings you more of the ceiling in terms of this is a guy who could develop into an elite receiving threat, an absolute alien, a Kyle Pitts type of guy. For me, McBride was still there, and I signed a guy like Njoku, who's maybe more of the guy I'm trying to develop into the alien. I think McBride is a guy who's going to come in, and you're getting a starting tight end. I think the floor is high, the ceiling is high, but the floor, you're pretty confident that he's going to come in and be good. I think as a blocker, he's very impressive, and that's the most important trait for this offense. Who'd you go with at pick 38?
Going back to the defensive side, I went with Daxton Hill, safety for Michigan. So obviously, I only added the one safety in free agency, making the big move with Marcus Williams. I did re-sign Joyner, but I think this is a spot where you can get as many bodies as possible, as much talent as possible. And I think he's a good spot here. One thing that I noticed looking at his advanced stats and stuff is that he played a lot in the slot as well. At Michigan, so does have some bring some versatility to the table in terms of having another guy who does have that kind of cornerback safety combination, like they have Jason Pinnock, who was drafted to be corner, now showing stuff at safety. To have someone who could do a little bit of both is useful too, but mainly he's there to compete, I think, against Joyner to be the starting safety next to Marcus Williams. So Daxton Hill with my 38th overall pick.
I like that pick as well. I wanted to go safety. in the third round, but I didn't want to position shop. I I was very close. I'll be honest. Luis Seen from Georgia went ahead of where I was picking. I was eyeing him, and then I didn't really want to reach for anybody. And once you get into the third round, at least at this stage in January, it's not like I'm too well versed in that many guys. But there was a guy who really did jump out to me. That was Jojo Dahman, the linebacker from Nebraska, who is a little bit on the older side, which would be the one downside, I guess, to him. But I think he makes a lot of sense as that pass coverage linebacker. Um, is very much in the Sala mold. And I contemplated signing a guy in free agency, but I just think of Ulbrich and Sala, both former linebacker coaches. And you look what they did last year, drafting two safeties and trying to develop them, and Quincy Williams. I think it's a position they will try to stay young at, will keep taking swings at, and hopefully they'll find their Fred Warner. And hopefully a guy like CJ Mosley being in the room can develop them. Dahman, I mean, he's born in 97, so it's not like he's crazy old. So I could have gone with somebody maybe a little younger, but I just love his profile for this defense. I think he's a guy that you're getting that can start immediately. I would, and honestly, I'll be honest, in an ideal world, I would probably get a safety here. But Dahman was the one guy that I had kind of knew of, and I liked what he was bringing to the table. There were a few guys that I did consider as well. Martin Emerson, the corner from Mississippi State. But at the end of the day, I went with Dahman. But again, January 26th here, we're recording this, so things are subject to change. Michael, who'd you go with in the third round?
I actually made a little bit of a mistake here. We were kind of debating whether we should do 2 rounds or 3 rounds. And once we said 3 rounds, I kind of picked the first guy that I saw that I was intrigued by. This pick does not make any sense. Now I'm now realizing it based on the
So,
other
well, you could change it.
investments that we made. I went with Jeremy Ruckert, so this would be our third pretty decent investment at tight end. Obviously, that is not something that should happen. I think he's worth talking about though.
Fire Nania.
Not obviously, I would not add a third tight end here, but Jets
We could play 13 personnel with
13
Schultz, Ruckert, and McBride.
How about we do this? Let's just reinvent the game. Everyone's going lighter personnel, playing up tempo. Let's sort of go against that and exploit all these nickel and dime defenses.
A 13
completely dominate teams.
A 13 personnel offense with an elite receiver. So I guess either it's Elijah Moore, like just for argument's sake, let's just throw whoever you think the best, like a Devontae Adams, whoever the best receiver is. If you had an elite 13 personnel, 3 great tight ends, I think a 13 personnel offense would be amazing. I like the idea of the Ruckert McBride. I mean, I'm being
I don't know. Maybe we'll stick with this. I mean, if I'm being real, would we do this? Absolutely not. But that's who I ended up picking here. Let's say in this scenario that Douglas accidentally wrote Jeremy Ruckert's name on the card somehow. He's like, oh no, that's not who I meant to pick. But then he's just got to roll with it, and you adapt your scheme to your players. Now we're the 13 personnel Jets.
You can either run whenever you want. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but 13 personnel, it's basically your jumbo package. You can run, or then you go play action. All three of those guys, competent receivers. You got an elite route runner. We're saying Devontae Adams. Hey, the 13 personnel offense. I mean, if that becomes a thing, we got to get credit for that. If you you don't want to position shop, but let's say obviously you probably wouldn't take Ruckert in that spot. What positions would you be looking at? Again, this is not how actual NFL teams look at this thing, but just looking at where your team is at, what positions would ideally interest you?
Well, this one is really interesting in the simulators, this third round pick, because the best players available, like you said, you never want to position shop, especially I think at the early parts of the draft where I think there's a bigger discrepancy in talent between, there can be a big drop off in talent between a couple of prospects at the top, whereas later in the draft, maybe you do pick for needs a little bit just to build pipeline, at positions where you need it. But earlier in the draft, still in the third round here, this is a spot where, you do see a lot of positions where they've kind of addressed already, like tight end, for example, here is a spot you could pick, but you also could get that in the second round already. There's a lot of offensive linemen tend to be the best players available at this spot. And probably at this point, they'll have that solved already, whether that's with the first round pick, free agency, or however they decide to do it. Edge is a constant position that you see as the BPA here a lot. that's probably something, at least in my simulation. And I think the way that they'll probably go about it is it might be solved by now. So this third round pick is a really interesting spot in terms of obviously the board probably isn't going to play out exactly how it looks in all these mock draft simulators, but just at least the way it's playing out on these, it is an interesting spot in terms of how you balance best player available versus need. You could go with, an offensive lineman to develop. You could sort of splurge at edge or tight end. So there are a lot of routes I could go here. What did you go with?
Well, I went with Dahmen, but I think, when I look at my team as a whole, and look, I mean, this was a team that was assembled in 10 minutes. I think what I see is a team that can compete, which is really what you want. And when I say compete, I don't mean for Super Bowl. I'll get to that in a second. What you really want from this team is just to be competitive. And that's a low bar. I'm talking about, but be competitive in December and January, be in that in the hunt graphic, win 8 or 9 games. Hell, if they win 9 games and they miss the playoffs, I'm happy. I think and as long as they show significant improvement, and then they got another offseason to really, you know, take off. I hope they can make the playoffs. I think this team would maybe have a chance to make the playoffs, but then one more offseason to really flood it with talent. And that lines up with what the plan has really been. If you listen to reports, it's that Joe Douglas came in saying, I'm going to get this team to be competing by 2024. I'm going to take the long path, though. So I think with this, when you look at this team, if they could make significant strides like that, the draft class is hopefully performs as equally as well as 2021. I think you're in a good spot. And then with one more offseason, you're talking about a team that if they hit their offseason, that's 3 off seasons in a row that you could count as hits. And again, it's all going to come down to Zach Wilson. You're looking at a team that could compete like the teams we just saw this weekend. I mean, you're looking at a team that could be in that weekend. It's all going to come down to Zach Wilson. But regardless of him, they need to, if they're going to win a Super Bowl, let alone get to one, they're going to need to assemble, deep, well-drafted team around him. And I think the types of off seasons me and you just drew up are some good roadmaps. I mean, we'll obviously tweak them and change our minds 20 other times between now and April. But I like what we worked out. Again, you can go to jetsxfactor.com. You can go and sign up and do this offseason simulator yourself. As I said, there will be some updates to the simulator in the few weeks, so they're over the coming weeks. So look out for that. You can follow us at CYJ Pod on Twitter. Myself, Ben W. Blessington, Michael at Michael_Nania. You can find us on jetsxfactor.com, which is the best place to go for Jets content. Michael, last thoughts?
I'm really excited for this offseason. I feel like we said it a few times already, but it's
just a few.
It's one of the most important off seasons in recent memory for the Jets.
They need a CEO head coach.
Yeah, they need a leader of men.
Yes.
But no, what I was going to say is not the cliche that we say every single year, but that this is going to be one of the more unpredictable Jets off seasons. I just feel like they're in previous off seasons. It's kind of felt really defined, kind of the main few things that they were looking for. But now there are so many different ways they can go. There are positions that could get no help or be the main thing they address across the board. There are just a lot of different ways it could play out. So it's going to be very interesting to see how everything goes down.
I think that you hit the nail on the head, because last year by February, it kind of felt like we knew Zach Wilson was going to be the pick. I mean, everything else was maybe more unpredictable. You never know for sure. But this year, yeah, I really have. I have a feeling that it's going to be draft night, and we really won't know who they're going to take at 4, because 4 is around the spot of the draft where things do start to get a little bit, can be surprising. 1, 2, and 3, you kind of already, maybe just 1 and 2, you kind of already know. Going into draft night. But I think you're going to enter that draft night not knowing who the Jets are going to draft. And again, for agency, I think they're going to be aggressive. Do I think they're going to be 2015 Mike McCagnon aggressive? Maybe not. But I think this is going to be the most aggressive Douglas we've seen. And I think you're going to see smart aggressive signings like Corey Davis and Carlson were, regardless of how that turned out. I think those were 2 smart aggressive signings. Go with the guys who are younger, not guys who are about to hit 30. Give yourself some escape routes, stuff like that. But I think you're going to see the Jets pay some big money and as we said, Marcus Williams, Dalton Schultz, these other guys. Anyways, it is exciting and it is unpredictable.
Yeah, it just feels like in 2020 it was like offensive line, and that is exactly what they ended up doing. They spent a lot of money on it, free agency. Then in the draft, you knew it was O-line or receiver, and they ended up going O-line. Then last year, they were going to make a big edge move. We kind of knew who the quarterback options were. Whereas this year, there are just so many different things that could happen.
Well, Michael, we said it all. I guess it's time to get out of here. We would like to get back onto our regularly scheduled Monday programming. This is going to come out on Thursday. We've been doing Monday, Thursdays, and then we fell off a little bit, and then we're doing Mondays. But I think we could commit to the once a week on Mondays. I know this is just what happens when you have. It was playoff football. We were going to record Sunday night, and then that Chiefs Bills game was so good, and I was moving, and my internet wasn't set up. It's just our apologies, but
top tier podcasting right here.
Top tier. Every week there's an apology. All right. Well, thank you for listening. Appreciate the support. We will be back sometime in the future. Hopefully, maybe not. You never know. Maybe we'll be back in a month. Who knows? I'm just kidding. We're gonna be back next week. Come on now. We'll be back next week. Plenty of stuff to talk about with the Jets. The Senior Bowl's coming up. I'm very excited about that. It's like an extra Jets game. So kind of. Thank you for listening. Everybody have a great week. Enjoy some playoff football, some stress-free football. No Pats, no Bucks, no Pats, no Tom Brady, no Bills. So now we're just cheering against Jackson Mahomes. So everybody have a great weekend. Go Jets.